Hello, welcome. Welcome to Enlightning. This is a show where we talk about cloud concepts and draw out what we discuss on the light board that you see behind me. Today, my guest is Carlos Santana. Welcome, Carlos. I'm so excited to be on here with
Hi,
you.
thank you for having
Hello.
me.
Oh, my pleasure. Let's start off by saying a little bit about who you are and why we're excited to learn from you.
Yeah, let me remove. I don't think that we need my name so many times in here. um, yeah, my name is Carlos Santana. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I went to college over there. And Carlos Santana's music wasn't that popular. I learned about the music of Carlos Santana when I moved to the U.S. and everybody was saying, "Oh, your name is Carlos Santana." Like, yes, my mom is also excited, and my brothers are excited. My name is that. Like, what is the big deal? Like, people like, and then I found out, like, yeah, he's a famous guitar player. I don't know, from the '60s or the '70s, and everybody knows their music and all that. And a lot of people, I guess, that me as a new junior developer joining like a lot of the leads and follow that music. So it was
Do
funny.
you
So
get
like.
so tired of having to talk about Carlos Santana, the
No,
musician, just
it's
in
it's
any episode.
fun, right? Because I don't know what they're talking about. They're like, yes, it's like being talked about by a famous person, right?
You get to feel famous without, yeah,
Yeah,
the burden
and
of fame. I like that.
it was funny because the manager, and I work for IBM, so that's the thing, that story. Like, I moved to the US after doing my electrical and computer engineer. Didn't start in software. Now I'm doing software, but the manager wanted to hire Jennifer Lopez. So this he was interviewing. I don't know if he hired me because of my name, but he hired me, Carlos Santana. He said he was trying also to hire Jennifer Lopez, that was in the meetings, doing interviews. So this is where, back in 2001, where like, a lot of companies brought like college students to do interviews with the massive amount of managers. Now interviews are a different way of doing them. Are you doing online and individually? So, but back in the days, a lot of companies were trying to hire as many engineers as possible, from different schools. So yeah,
Jennifer
Jennifer Lopez.
Lopez
Yeah, so
on
Jennifer
the same
Lopez
team
and
as
Carlos
Carlos
Santana.
Santana.
Yeah. Um,
Excellent.
I think there's a Jennifer Lopez in IBM. There's two Carlos Santanas in IBM. IBM is
Oh,
very
wow.
big.
So
Um,
let's say hello to some people who are here, and then I want to hear more about your professional story. So Abhishek's here again. Hello, good to see you. Nick,
Hello.
the first one. Hi. Uh, Komarju says hello from India. Hi, thanks for watching. Looks like we got that's hello, Napalm. Good to see you. Congratulations on your certification. And hello from Zero Boy. Hi, hi. Oh, and Joy's here. Hi, Joy. Excellent.
Yeah, we have a lot of
So
folks in Twitch.
Carlos, yeah, it's great. Thanks everyone for coming. So Carlos, let's tell us about your professional history and
Yeah.
what
So
you came to
I
teach us today.
yeah. So I started in IBM, on tools, for, I would say, administrators. So I still continue doing that. um, for administrators in the data center. So I work a lot with servers,
Okay.
hardware, and those type of things. And the software that I did was, I guess we're still reinventing the wheel. I did software around deploying servers, like physical servers, with Pixie booting and taking a CD, and then the CD comes in the box. So I was in charge of writing the code of that CD in that IBM server that you bought and you brought into your data center. And then you
Wow.
either Pixie boot or put it a CD or USB key, and then you install Windows NT or Red Hat or SUSE, um, and deploy the operating system. And that ended there, right? There wasn't any
Uh-huh.
cloud providers or public cloud. Then I moved for more up to the cloud, platform, doing mobile development. So I did
Mm-hmm.
open source with Apache Foundation. So Cordova, was a maintainer of Cordova. So, working in IBM, there's a lot of companies. I guess in 2013, that to 14, there's a lot of companies like, wanted to have an app in the App Store. Insurance
Okay. Yeah.
companies.
I remember
There
those
was
days. Uh-huh.
so we were helping them to make those apps secure. So it's like insurance
Okay.
company, banks. So I help a
Uh-huh.
lot of companies build their mobile platform using the cloud and the developer tools. So I wrote the tools for that, help them build the tools. And then I moved, I think in 2015, 16, their term serverless came on board. And
Uh-huh.
Lambda, one of the first ones that did that with AWS and IBM and all the IBM cloud providers. We're co-competitors, co-friends. In open
Uh-huh.
source, we all work together. But
Yep.
in the market share, right, we try to get as much business as possible. So IBM started doing a open source project called OpenWhisk. So is
Uh-huh.
in functions as a service service. So I was the architect and developed that function as a service, and we were able to implement that in IBM Cloud. So I was able to do that, and then that was my journey into SRE practice, observability. Like, how do I run a system at scale, multiple regions, multiple clusters, multiple data centers, and provide it as a service in a secure way. And at that time, we got functions as a service out, and also we were working with Kubernetes community of a Kubernetes service in IBM, and working
Uh-huh.
in open source. OpenWhisk wasn't based on Kubernetes, but
Uh-huh.
Kubernetes was coming on board, and we migrated OpenWhisk to run in Kubernetes. But it was
Mm-hmm.
still a proprietary way of packaging your software. It wasn't
Okay.
like containers like we do today. Like, you package your code in a container, and
Mm-hmm.
I give you a container, and everybody knows how the API specification of a container is, and they can
Mm-hmm.
run it. So we partner with other companies. At that time was Red Hat, VMware, Google, and Trigger Mesh and other ones to create a project called Knative, to see if we
Okay.
can have a specification for cloud
Uh-huh.
providers to tell the end users if that you don't have to package your code in a certain specific way for a specific platform or vendor. Like, we can,
That's
every vendor we can give, like, if you are writing your code and you package it in a standard way, a container, like,
uh-huh.
that's why it's where everything is being a container, then just
Uh-huh.
give it to me, and then we'll run it for you, and you don't have to worry about the scaling it. Or so that's the API, or the contract
So
runtime that we refer to. So we came up
there
with Knative as an API.
There are a few things I love about your story. One is that you have deep experience both on the ops side and as an application developer, it sounds like. So I think that's pretty cool that you have like the big picture experience. And then you're touching on some things that I'm excited to learn about later when we get behind the light board, like serverless. I'd like to hear your definition of that and kind of dig into that a little bit. And also functions as a service is something I know a little bit about, but I would like to hear more about that. And then it's fascinating to me. A lot of like my first impression of Knative was just serverless. Like it was almost like the same thing. And now that I've learned more about it, I understand that Knative offers a lot more than just something like serverless, whatever that is, which we'll talk about. And but what you're telling, but I did definitely understand Knative to be something that runs on top of Kubernetes. So it's fascinating to hear now that Knative was around. It sounds like before Kubernetes, or can also exist outside of the Kubernetes ecosystem.
Yep. That's okay.
That's
Knative what started the Knative Serving. I think today we're going to touch on Knative Serving. We can also do a Knative eventing. So we have two pieces of components that go together when we have creating, like, um, cloud functions or event-driven applications, or like elastic way of creating your applications. So for Knative Serving, it started as an API. The implementation, so that way there's more flexibility to have different implementations, and a lot of open source projects work that way. They work on an API, and then
mm-hmm.
usually the open source version, and it used to be happen a lot in the past. The open source version was kind of like, here's something that you can run on your laptop, and everybody was able to run it in their laptop. But the one that actually ran in production was an
Uh-huh.
implementation by that vendor one, an implementation by vendor two, an implementation by vendor three. But all of them implemented the API that, as a
Okay.
user, that you
You
were
could
using
run
that software in your
locally.
laptop, it was the same as
Uh-huh.
using it for vendor one and vendor two. And then you made your choice of, like, do I want to pay vendor one, or do I want to pay vendor two? Or I can start with vendor one, like, I'm not getting along with vendor one, let me go to vendor two. You don't have to change
Mm-hmm.
everything. That's the beauty of creating standards, and that's why in open source we spend
Mm-hmm.
so much time of, like, and then people see us like fighting over like a simple name of a variable or an API
Uh-huh.
protocol, is because these things at the end of the day is what marks the standard for the consumption of this the software. And the
Uh-huh.
implementation comes later. And that, like I said, in the past it used to be like that, little bit more. Now in the future, 2022, people are using the open source code, and instead of having
Uh-huh.
implement like, because they discovered that they were inventing the wheel. Like at the end of the day, just
Uh-huh.
doing like vendor one, vendor two, vendor three. Maybe one was using Java, another one which is C++, another one using Python. And it's like
Uh-huh.
you are folks are writing the same code, kind of, right?
Yep.
Different languages, right? Maybe one was
Uh-huh.
for a different architecture CPU, like mainframe X90 or PowerPC, and then another one for x86. But I think these days, open source have taken over the world. So like, okay, let's work together on the source code. The source
Uh-huh.
code is something that everyone can have for free, and then
Uh-huh.
compiling it, I even like, let's compile it. Running it is the difficult part. So that will be like, that source code run by vendor one, vendor two is the same code, but who's going to secure it better? Who's going to be faster?
Okay.
Like the non-functional requirements. I know I'm throwing a
So
lot of
there's
like technical terms out there for folks, but that's kind of like the journey, how I, how we went in my open source journey also, because I've been doing this and I started with that mobile project, open source Cordova, OpenWiz, and now Knative. So the last 10 years I've been doing open source. So you see the progression of like the benefits and the work that have been done in open source to actually get to a point that we are today. But it used not used to be like that.
Yeah, and it's really cool as someone coming in from the outside, like joining the Knative Slack workspace, for example, just to see how kind everyone is and how like even though everyone's at different companies and technically competitors, it does feel like a community, and it's a wonderful place and a great vibe. Java Grunt is very excited. Yes, let's run on our laptop. And then Java Grunt said, "Did you say Cordova? What's
Yes,
Cordova?"
Cordova. It's Apache Cordova. It's an open source project in
No.
Apache Software Foundation, and it used to be called PhoneGap. So some people know it as PhoneGap. So it was a way of creating. Basically, I was doing a lot of mobile development, JavaScript. I'm a JavaScript head. I started with jQuery and all. Name the web framework. I have I have done it. I stopped a little bit when React became Realstream. But it was a way of a person that knew web development, like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. At that time, the mobile providers like Android, iOS, BlackBerry, Windows, you have to write the code in their programming language, like Objective
Ah.
C and Swift
Uh-huh.
or C
Uh-huh.
Sharp or Java. And a lot of developers just wanted to use JavaScript. So how do we create? And they were creating beautiful web UIs. So how do we take the JavaScript and put it into a native application and running in your phone, and the user, to the point that the user cannot tell the difference of like if it's a native written with the native code or not. So that's kind of
Uh-huh.
like that was the user experience, which I do a lot of user experience and design. So that's my experience that came out of that.
So I want to, there's a lot of great stuff happening in chat. I'm going to roll these questions out and then I'm going to maybe in the background just start sneaking my way back behind the light board.
Sure.
Cora says, hello. Hi, Cora. So great to see you. Java Grunt says, that's so awesome. I'm a fan. We took Cordova to production back in the day.
Yep.
And then Abhishek has a question. I've always wondered, how does open source products generate revenue? So while you answer that, I'm going to start getting myself behind the light board.
So yeah, the open source products generate revenue. I think that the two words, the part that is open source and product, are two distinct things. Like product make revenue, open source doesn't make revenue. You use open source to build products to generate revenue. So for example, the Apache HTTP source code is available, so that's open source. um, if you want to talk about like business revenue, it will be like you take that open source code, you take it, you download it, you compile it, you rent a server, and then you run that, and then you charge people saying like, do you want to run your web page? I'll run it for you for $1 a month. But it actually cost me 50 cents. So I'm going to make 50 cents for every dollar that I charge, and that's how I make revenue out of open source, right? I took the open source code, and I'm making money out of it. The flip side is like, am I going to be a good citizen if I find a bug in that open source code, or if I tweak something to make it a little bit better? Am I going to be a good citizen and give that change or improvement, or that bug fix back to that community that owns that open source code, or that foundation that owns that open source code, or are going to keep it to myself? Um, so if you're a good citizen, you're going to contribute it back, and that's what we call like contribution back from to open source from people that are making revenue. I don't know if that answered the question, but um, product open source is not the product.
So, and someone, Nick in chat says support and donations and ads helps them. But to me, it's like you use the open source as the base, and everyone using the same base helps make it multi-cloud and multi-vendor, and then you layer your proprietary stuff on top.
Yeah, I think who was the person that said Nick the first one says about
Yeah.
donation, support and ads. I think it's
Uh-huh.
referring not to maybe I want to distinct like revenue versus funding, right? And that's
Hmm.
a little bit more clear. Like revenue is like maybe to a business, is more relatable to
Hmm.
a business. Funding is to fund a charity, right? Like
Hmm.
Goodwill, a 503c corporation, right? That is for nonprofit. So that not say company but corporation or LLC or a nonprofit organization needs money, right?
Uh-huh.
Either money to have the building for people to bring the food for a food bank, right? The money to pay the electricity, maybe money to pay contractors to help work on that building. So there needs to
Hmm.
be money there. So the money that goes into that foundation is from donations, or that nonprofit organization can give something out. It could be an ad on a web page that they have, because people are like looking at to that foundation, or mostly is donation. That's what people do. They either individually, like you're giving, like GitHub has a donation method. Like you can give $5 a month to a person that you're using their open source project. So I do
Okay.
it with a few folks. I give like $5 a month because either they're writing good blog posts that they share their source code and examples, and I learn from them, or I use them and I give them $5 a month. So I'm encouraged to give $5 a month to that open source project, a contributor person, or a company, like I said before, the company that took the code from HTTPS and making 50 cents for every dollar. So maybe he making $1 million a year for that free software.
Uh-huh.
And he said, I'm going to give
Perfect.
$10,000 back to the foundation. And that's how foundations like Apache Foundation and CNCF foundations work. It's like you have members, companies that make revenue, and out of that revenue, they're going to take some part of that money. It could be $50,000, $40,000, and
Uh-huh.
there's different tiers in CNCF, and that will give that money to that foundation, and then the foundation can use that to for the different services that the open source projects need. So yeah, I'm a fan of open source. I could be talking all day about how open source works.
Rick is here. He says can't stay, but popping in to say hi to two of my favorite people.
Oh,
That's
that's
so
nice,
nice,
Rick.
Rick. Cora said there are also commercial distributions of open source software that offer additional features or address particular use cases. So, like
Yep.
large enterprise needs or pre-configured add-ons. That's a great
Yeah, you can
point.
redistribute the open source software under a certain license, and then you can make revenue out of it. But you have to comply to the different licenses. Yep.
Nice. And then Nick was clarifying what he said before. When I say supports, I've seen open source having support hours for a fee. Like if you had an issue with the project, you would pay them, so you would have support from the creators.
Yep. Yeah. Some creators, that's how they make money. They create a cool software and say like, I'm not going to charge you for the software, but I'm going to charge you for either going to your company and give a workshop, or
Mm-hmm.
give you 1 hour a week to help you fix a bug or help you configure it properly or secure it. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. All right, here we are. What is Knative serving? Where would you like to start in the definition? We kind of
So
got a history of it, and so now we'll talk about where is it now. And actually, before you say anything, if anyone in the chat has experience with Knative, I'd love to hear about it or any questions off the bat. And
yeah,
then now take it away, Carlos.
yeah.
Carlos, where
Even
would you
if you
like to
have
start?
downloaded and running on your laptop, that was kind of the last things that we focus in was like making it super easy to run in a laptop. It didn't used to be like that way, and people will be surprised. So we're talking about Knative serving. Knative
Uh-huh.
has two, I would say, two major components. It's Knative serving and Knative eventing. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
we can do another live stream on Knative eventing, or you can,
We're
or if you have
doing
one for another
actually
person.
Mauricio
Oh,
Saladino
Mauricio,
is coming
yes.
on.
So he'll be
He's
perfect to
coming
do
on
that. Yep. So
in
Mauricio
2 weeks
works
to
with
do
us
eventing.
in open source in Knative. So Knative eventing and Knative serving. So for Knative eventing, I think that was the main focus where we started the project with. And eventing is more event driven applications with cloud events. So for serving, let's focus on serving,
And
which is that the story I was telling about, like I have an API, stateless API, that I want to hit with a URL, and that URL will return back some data, and that data could be a web page, HTML, or that data could be JSON, or for people that are famous, I like SOAP, it will be XML, but not lately.
mhm.
XML not being the data that comes back. So Knative Serving is an API specification to help any business or any organization that wants to provide an easy way to users to have a stateless compute package and served. So it's an API specification that is kind of a simple contract on how do I give code to another business or organization to run it for me, and I'm going to be willing to pay for it. And for the majority of the models, is you do a billing based on requests. So if nobody's using your code, you should not be paying,
Mhm.
right? If it's not being used, is you're not paying, and that's kind of
Mhm.
like the beauty of serverless. So that's why Knative Serving is associated with serverless, where
Okay. Oh,
you don't buy a server, you don't have to be concerned with the server or concerned of
uh-huh.
maybe be worried about paying for the server if you're not using it. But how do I give
Uh-huh.
you code or program that you can run it on demand, and then only pay
Uh-huh.
when it gets used, not when I don't pay when if it's not get used. Um,
So Knative serving, if we're talking about just the main definition now, I kind of got it's an API specification and it assists with scale to zero or serverless is one thing.
I
What
think
else did you
it
say? I think I missed some things.
assist users to I guess assist users to give their code to be run on a serverless way,
Okay. That
right? So
assists
it's
with
because it
running
includes
code.
the runtime contract. Um,
Okay.
so it's an API specification that is I'm going to give you my code. And in this case, we're talking a lot with containers. So I'm going to give you my container, and I
Mhm.
want you to run it for me. So what is the specification that I need to know to be able to give you my code and you run it for me? And I
Mhm.
don't want to pay when it's not used. So it needs to, if the and that's the, as and you can put a question mark, right? If you want to scale to zero, it's up to the business that is giving that service. So I may say, like, I'm going to be willing to not scale it to zero, or I may be willing to scale it to zero immediately, or maybe I leave it like, if nobody's using it, maybe I leave it up for 2 hours just in case somebody shows up
Uh-huh.
and it can serve the traffic faster. And then after 2 hours, if
Uh-huh.
nobody's using it, I can scale to zero. But in a nutshell, that's the serverless part of, like, not worrying about the server being up or down. It just
Uh-huh.
runs on demand.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense and it sounds like it's very configurable. We have a comment from Java Grunt. Java Grunt says they set up TCE, which is Tanzu Community Edition, with Knative Serving, and now following along with this presentation. Super cool.
Yeah, and you want to give folks what TCE is.
Tanzu Community Edition.
Yes.
You can.
you passed. You have an A plus.
It's a Java Grunt. Maybe you can help me. It's an open source distribution of a way to run Kubernetes. You can run it locally, or you can run it managed. You can manage.
Yeah, Community
Kubernetes
Edition is
clusters with other
it's free,
Kubernetes
right? So
clusters.
you can run it. You can run it in the laptop or anything. It's very easy to
And
get it up and run with
Kubernetes
Kubernetes. Yeah.
plus plus. So it's
Yeah,
Java
with
Grunt.
some
What's cool
packages.
is, yeah, it has the packages. So if you want to add Knative or add Kpack for or add a lot of things, it's already there. So you could just throw it right in there instead of having to add it to your cluster from scratch.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but
Kubernetes with a lot of open source extras.
Yeah, but I personally didn't mention Kubernetes, right? I'm trying to define Knative Serving as an API and not Kubernetes yet.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a specification contract. So remember the story about vendor 1, vendor 2, vendor 3. So for example, if you have a vendor 1 and they implement this API standard specification, and I give them my container to run it, and maybe I'm paying like $2 a month because I'm running like 5 million invocations a month. So it's like, let's say like it's $2 that is my bill. And it's like, well, I found a provider that is closer to my users, and it's like 150, right? $1.50. So I want to move to that one. How much time do I need to spend this weekend to do that? Like, that's the mindset of the developer, right? Like, not he's not going to sit with the board or anything. Like, well, if it's a enterprise, it will sit with the board, but let's keep it simple. Like a developer, like, how much time do I need this weekend to say if I can move my code and say, like, from the GitHub repo, move it to vendor 2 that is 150 instead of $2. If that second vendor doesn't implement this API specification, or it doesn't take containers at all, I need to like repackage and compile my code differently. And then I need to package differently. I need to change my code to make it sure that it works on that vendor too. Then it's a little bit more time than just a weekend. But if that vendor too has this API specification, and I'm already building containers, I can say like, well, take my container and run it for me, and then I'll start paying over there, right? Or it could be like
time to do fun stuff on the weekend. Go to the park.
Or it could be like the vendor 1 doesn't have a data center in a certain place, so I need to look for another vendor. Even if I pay the same amount of money, right? I need to look for another vendor that where users are closer to that my code is closer, so it's less latency. I want to deploy my code in that region or that country, or I need to deploy in that country and cannot leave that country. I will deploy to. So I just code. Like, going back to my roots of Cordova, like, code once, deploy anywhere. So that's kind of like what the mobile thing was. Like, you write your JavaScript once and you deploy to Android and iOS. You don't care if it's Android or iOS. In this case, it's to two cloud providers.
I like that. Code once, deploy anywhere.
Yep. And then, so if this API specification, since it's open source, it means it's in GitHub, right? And it's available for any. I don't have to pay anything to implement this API specification. So that means I can like start writing some C++ code, and in a little server that I have at home, I can implement this API and I can run my code at home, for example. And then my container will run at home. It will run on the cloud, or it can run inside a building, right, at a company. So it's kind of like the hybrid approach of running the code anywhere.
And this has more to do with like specifications in general than with Knative specifically. Is that correct, or is some of this unique to Knative?
This is the Knative specification. So this is talking about like how to run my compute or serverless HTTP, right? Will not be a database. for
Uh-huh.
example. So this is Knative Serving is around HTTP, stateless applications, microservices, web apps, things that implement the HTTP protocol. So or gRPC, which is based on HTTP, or WebSockets. So those are the different type
Mm-hmm.
of protocols that we're scoping this into.
Okay. Would you like me to capture that, the protocols, or
Yeah,
right
HTTP
now?
based. So yeah, it's important to for
Yeah.
because if someone has a protocol that is not HTTP based,
Mm-hmm.
then that will be something for them to be aware. Like, oh, that I cannot use the Knative Serving because Knative Serving is heavily based on HTTP.
You said WebSockets also, right?
Yeah, HTTP, WebSockets, and gRPC are kind of like the
Okay.
protocols. As a developer, when you write, you take a library or framework that you want to implement your web API, you'll be using probably these three ways of
Or
doing it.
PC. And
Let me see if there's any questions.
there is a question. It's from Abhishek. Scale to zero is bringing pod replicas down.
Yes, we'll go into. I think
Mm,
folks watch the other episodes, so we talk about what is a pod. So yeah, scale to zero is you have the deployment. It's like no pods are running. So we can start talking about Kubernetes. Like where does Kubernetes come into play here?
nice.
And I
We're
think
going
people
to
are.
talk about
Go ahead.
maybe draw that. We're going to draw out the scale to zero. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail
Yeah.
later, I think. Is that correct?
Yes.
Um, cool. And Layla says, hello, everyone. I want to give a shout out to Layla. She's putting on a .NET and Beyond's conference next week. I'm going to be out of town. So it's going to be streaming on our Twitch channel, and it'll be Wednesday and Thursday, and it seems like it's going to be a blast. Layla, will you put a link in chat about it, please? It's great. So So, so far I have for a Knative definition, avoiding Kubernetes. It's going to assist with running your code. It's going to assist with running it in a serverless manner, and it's going to use these particular protocols, HTTP, WebSockets, and gRPC.
And you can add containers. Maybe another bullet is this is
Okay.
where we're talking about the developer doesn't have to compile or package their code in a way that is vendor specific. So it's open containers. So we're using the open standard of using the OCI containers, and that's kind of like the
And
what brings Kubernetes to the mainstream, using containers because
mhm.
Kubernetes is an orchestrator.
Use, uses OCI. We've covered this in a past episode, but OCI is Open Container Initiative. And then it falls right into line with keeping all the specifications vendor neutral so they can be used across technologies and across companies.
Yeah, the little example that I said that if I want to go to another vendor, I already have the container pipeline. I already did the CI/CD. I have a working container. It's a matter like who do I give this container to run it for me? And it's a package specification, and then that's how you put your code in there. So if you have a container, you have half of the battle of the cloud computing one.
Uh-huh.
Um, you
I
you
love that.
yeah. Before another proprietary systems was like you needed for people that are not aware, you needed to put the code in a zip file, right, and then put that zip file in an object storage, and then tell the vendor say grab the zip file from my vendor from the bucket or the storage, right, and then the second vendor's like, yeah, you have to put it in a zip file, but the folders and the files need to be in different location. Like what? Okay, I create a second
Uh,
zip file, and then the third one like another
wow.
zip file. But then the containers started like moving along the way, and then most vendors now say like you can give me a zip file, okay, fine, you can give me a container layer, for example,
Okay.
and
That sounds
things
so
don't
much
fit in that
more.
zip file. Some zip files that those vendors say like, well, it needs to be a zip file, but it needs to be 48 megs or less, and you're like, but I
Uh-huh.
want to run like open office, right? An open office is maybe it's 200 megs or 500 megs, and it works
Uh-huh.
fine as a container.
Uh-huh.
Or maybe you want to put the little bit of logic and an AI model inside a container, and it's like 1 gig, and like no, it cannot be 1 gig, right? And then that's where the problem starts happening. Like containers just solve that issue depending where you're running on.
It seems like so many issues are solved. That sounds like a tedious and complex process that used to exist before containers.
Yeah, I'd like to
Um,
tell that story because when we talk about the tools that we have today, it can either be cloud native tools like OpenShift and IBM Cloud and Tanzu, and we're giving folks like the only thing that you have to do is write a container and deploy it to this platform. Some folks like those has too difficult, but they don't know how more difficult it was in the past,
uh-huh.
so they don't appreciate like the current state, right? They always try to
Yeah.
complain about like, can you make it easier? Can you make it easier? To the point that we make it
Uh-huh.
like magic, and then they complain like, it's too much magic. Tell me how actually it works. Like, so that's how engineers and developers work, right?
We have a question, and it's something we'll touch on a little more, but is Knative a service running in a Kubernetes cluster? Is our question.
Yep.
So maybe that's a great transition to maybe going into how Knative works with Kubernetes instead of this definition is great, but it can be closely tied and improve your experience on Kubernetes,
Yes.
if I'm not
So this,
mistaken. Yeah.
yeah. So this is the abstraction. And I think you have almost
Mm-hmm.
2 episodes talking about abstractions. So people know what
Mm-hmm.
an abstraction is. So this is an abstraction, and a lot of people say like, well, that's fine, but it's sitting on the board, right, in a piece of
Uh-huh.
paper. Like, how do I actually run my Python code, or how do I actually
Yeah.
like take my Java application or my Go program and making it work serverless? So
Yeah.
in the open source project, we say like, well, let's have a reference implementation. And what best reference implementation to get some code running than Kubernetes? So
Yeah.
that's where we started working on. Well, let's try to make Knative, or let's make the project or this API specification native to Kubernetes. So for folks that
Mm-hmm.
are using Kubernetes today, they can continue using that native programming model and continue using
Mm-hmm.
Knative to it. So now Knative will be an extension, or the implementation will
Mm-hmm.
be an extension to Kubernetes. It's an add-on. So for the folks who were asking, like,
So
how do I add Knative to a Kubernetes? We'll be adding it as an extension or a plus plus value and an add-on to Kubernetes.
so so Kubernetes will still have the pods and the deployments and replica sets and all running, but Knative helps you manipulate those things at a higher level.
Yes,
So
that
if
will
you
be
want
another
to get that,
abstraction.
yeah, if you want to get in there and manipulate on the Kubernetes level, you can, but then Knative is going to add more to that.
Yes, yeah, we
Great.
would lever would tip we'll sit on top of Kubernetes. So because
Mm-hmm.
we didn't want to pick another computing platform or container orchestration, because I think Kubernetes have become the standard for distributing programming, implementation, distributed programming, having a container orchestrator. So Kubernetes uh, has a lot of value. So we're going to sit
Mm-hmm.
on top of it and see if we can make Kubernetes easier to use, or make Kubernetes
Mm-hmm.
work in a serverless way using Knative.
All right. So maybe we'll do does it make sense to do a quick recap of how an application runs on Kubernetes so we can talk about how Knative improves the experience
Yeah, we can do that. I don't think we have to go as deep, because I think you went over that in the episode with Rick.
with
But
Rick?
in
Yeah.
Kubernetes, what typically you have is a deployment for
Uh-huh.
stateless applications. This type of stateless application, HTTP based. So let's say you have
Mm-hmm.
a backend business logic API that you want to deploy in Kubernetes. You will create
Mm-hmm.
a deployment, um, and you can say that that deployment um, has, let's say, 3 replicas,
Okay.
and 3 replicas meaning 3 pods.
Deployment, and your deployment has 3 pods.
So we'll draw
I'll do.
what a typical Kubernetes deployment looks like for someone not using Knative yet, right? So it'll be a
Okay.
deployment, and then you say you want 3 replicas. So if one of the pods goes down, the other two can
Mm-hmm.
receive the traffic, and then we have a service pointing to those pods. So you have
Okay.
a service that is has the endpoints of those pods, and is the interface, the entry point to find those pods. So as they change versions and you delete pods and new pods come in, or you scale up the number of replicas or scale down the number of replicas based on CPU and memory, like the Kubernetes comes with the HPA, horizontal pod autoscaler, that can say like,
Mm-hmm.
if there's not enough memory, or these pods are using too much memory, bring another pod, create another pod. Or if they're not using that much memory or CPU, delete some pods. And that's basically on
Mm-hmm.
the utilization, but you need to start with one. That's the trick. You cannot go to
Mm-hmm.
zero. A lot of people
Yeah.
think like, well, if I go to zero, like, how do I go back? The difficult part is not going to zero. In this aspect is you can go to zero,
Mm-hmm.
then walk away to grab some coffee. There's no pods will come up, because there's no
Yeah.
one, like, there's no memory or CPU to get from those pods, because no pods exist. So the difficult part, I usually joke, is scaling to zero is the easy part. Scaling from zero to one is what we're solving with
Uh-huh.
Knative. um
That makes so much sense. Yeah.
yeah, and some people are like, well, scale to zero, and like, well, how do I scale back from zero to one if there's no pods to get the CPU utilization, right? So this is a
Yeah.
typical. So actually the net problem of the serverless aspect in Kubernetes. You cannot do scale to zero, because you cannot do scale to zero to one back. So you have a
Okay.
service, you have a deployment, and then the other thing
Oh,
that Knative will bring in is, you talked with Rick, was an ingress. So an ingress sits in
Ingress.
front of the service, and the ingress is basically like a way to expose that your web API to outside the cluster. And that ingress, usually you want to, in some cases, you want to implement it with HTTPS, secure connection. So instead of
Mm.
HTTP is very easy by default, but if you want to add the S to it, HTTPS,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to configure something in Kubernetes, to add something to it. So it will be like the certificate, to add a certificate for the ingress to terminate that SSL connection. So you need to configure that ingress with a TLS secret and key for HTTPS, for example, a domain name. Um, and that there's a good project that is used everywhere. It's called Cert Manager, and you can add Cert
Mm-hmm.
Manager to help you with the automation of getting a certificate for your endpoint, and get the key, the certificate, and the private key, to make it HTTPS. So that's something extra that you have to configure, um, and you have to configure it a little bit manually. So every time you create a new service, then you have to go and
Mm-hmm.
kind of like manipulate to create a certificate for that domain. And you create the second one, create another one, and then Cert Manager from that point will continue like, um, revoking or renewing. That's the word, renewing the certificate to get a new one before it expires. But you're in charge of like that toil, that extra work of like, oh, we have another um, domain name or another service. Let's
Uh-huh.
create it there. So that's something that Knative is going to help a little bit with that, to have the domain name configure with a certificate, and have an HTTPS. So that's extra work that when you start with
Uh-huh.
Kubernetes, everybody stops.
That's it.
All the tutorials stop at HTTP, and like
Uh-huh.
90% of the people
That's
like,
some
I'm done.
experience.
I'm Kubernetes developer. I get the CKA, the Certified Kubernetes
Uh-huh.
Administrator, or
Yeah.
a
Uh-huh.
developer. I'm good for that. And then you go to a real job, and like, we have to make like the green lock in the browser. And like, oh, how do we do that? Well, you have to go in there
Uh-huh.
and create certificates, get the key, an SSL, or maybe
Uh-huh.
Let's Encrypt, talk to Let's Encrypt, configure it with your DNS, configure your DNS
Uh-huh.
that Let's Encrypt actually validates that you own that domain name. So Let's Encrypt will give you back a certificate, and you put it in a Kubernetes secret for the ingress to read it and then be HTTPS.
So,
And people are like, oh, wow, I have to do all that? Yes, you have to do all that. But
uh-huh.
Knative will be able to do that for you automatically.
Nice. I have an episode coming up on security for application developers. So
Oh, very
I
good.
look forward to hearing more details about this. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a typical HPA deployment serving ingress and HTTPS. So I think we can move
And
to
then
Knative.
excellent. Let's do it. So we're going to talk about next, how does Knative work? Oh, we have some activity in the chat. Findle's here. Hi, Findle. Late today, but now I'm here. Hello, hello. And then Java Crunch says, so I should be doing a Knative service plus a cert manager with an HTTPS example. That sounds like a great thing. Let me know
Yeah.
when you make that. I would love to see it.
Yeah, Knative Serving can do two type of ways of getting that certificate for you. Will usually with Let's Encrypt. It can do an HTTPS, a HTTP 01 or a DNS 01. That's like that validation of like when you want to get a certificate from Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt needs to validate that you own the domain name. So it can either check saying, I'm going to give you a URL to
Mm-hmm.
Let's Encrypt, and Let's Encrypt will call it and to validate that it responds with a certain secret, and then that it knows that it's you, and then it will give you a certificate. Or you can configure it to check on your DNS records. Say, I'm going to put this text in my DNS record. Let's Encrypt can check
Mm-hmm.
if you have that there to make sure like you own that domain name. I'm going to give you a certificate for that domain name.
Okay.
So that's how the configuration works around HTTPS. So we start.
Excellent.
So when you start with Knative Serving, and it used
Mm-hmm.
to be that Knative Serving, Knative Eventing was a deployment installation that was together, and it was very big. So
Mm-hmm.
we did
Uh-huh.
some work to actually separate the two projects, Eventing from Serving. So you can use Serving by itself, or you can use Eventing
Nice.
by itself, or you don't have to install one or the other. You can install one or the other.
Uh-huh.
So that way, if you only want to have the serverless piece or the auto scaling piece, you can just install Serving on top of Kubernetes. So
Love that.
the way you start is you get a Kubernetes cluster, and a Kubernetes cluster could be a TCE, it could be Minikube, it could be Kind, it could go. You can go to one of the many cloud providers and say like, give me a Kubernetes cluster, and this goes back to that we're talking about API specification. So
Mm-hmm.
now that multiple vendors or cloud providers, you can go to any of them and say like, give me a Kubernetes cluster based on the
Uh-huh.
Kubernetes specification. Each one will give you a Kubernetes cluster. So you can go to vendor one, like, give me a Kubernetes cluster. Like, well, I don't want to use you anymore. I want to vendor two. Give me a Kubernetes cluster. Oh, I want to run
Uh-huh.
Kubernetes in my house or in my business. I can implement. So that API works in there. So that's the benefit of having API. So for Knative Serving, if you install Knative Serving on any Kubernetes
Uh-huh.
cluster, then you can use Knative in any place that they support Kubernetes, and that's the benefit of using Knative as a Kubernetes extension or add-on.
Excellent.
So the way
Super cool.
in the Knative website, if you want to get started by installing Kubernetes, that's kind of a administrator role of installing, getting a cluster and installing Knative. Usually, developer is not the one that is going to be in charge of that, because we want developers to
Mm-hmm.
concentrate on writing the business logic, writing the unit test, writing the Java code or the Go code, and push it to Git. And that should
Uh-huh.
be their role, and that's what they usually get paid for, um,
Yeah.
right? And they're very good at it. And then some process or some other humans take that code from Git, right, from that source code, and goes through a CI/CD pipeline to make sure that can have a secure supply chain pipeline to create
Mm-hmm.
secure containers and deploy the containers into
Mm-hmm.
Kubernetes. But in this case, instead of implementing a deployment, we're going to say Knative Serving. So
Okay.
if somebody watching this want to start quickly with Knative, if you go to the website, um, there's a Knative Quick Start, and there's a CLI called the KN. So Knative comes with a KN CLI that you can install on your laptop.
Okay.
And then you
Mm-hmm.
can install a plugin called the Quick Start, and you can run the command kn quick start, and then you can run it with kind, and this would like bring
Mm-hmm.
up a Kubernetes cluster using kind, which a lot of Kubernetes developers use, or you can use kn quick start minikube, which a lot of developers use, and then that will create a very small Kubernetes cluster, and then install Knative on it, and then have it ready in your laptop, then you can start using either KN or kubectl. So that's how you get started with Knative Serving. Like installing Knative Serving is as easy as installing it with the KN CLI in your laptop. I recommend that if you're doing it in your laptop, just do the quick start. That's the easiest way. It's almost as similar as the one that we have in our GitHub Actions for our CI/CD. Um, or just follow the other instructions, which is Java ground suggested TCE, right? You have TCE
Uh-huh.
and then add Knative Serving package to it, right? One add-on, boom. Or you can
Bam.
go yes. Or you have Kubernetes somewhere, right? OpenShift, or it could be JKE, or it could be any EKS. And then we have the YAMLs that you can just apply the YAMLs for Knative Serving, and then that will
Uh-huh.
install Knative Serving. And
Okay.
one thing that Knative Serving needs is an ingress implementation that is specific to Knative. And then you'll
Okay.
be choosing between Courier, Istio, and Contour. It used to be like Istio was the only option, and that's the way. That's
Mm-hmm.
and Istio is a little bit big
Yeah.
for. It used to, and now it's a little bit smaller, but it used to be like Istio was too big, and then serving and eventing, and then the Kubernetes cluster that was very difficult to run in your laptop.
Uh-huh.
So the Knative Quick Start only installs the minimum
Mm.
one. It installs Courier and Kubernetes, and then you have Knative available like out of the box with the default configuration.
So, did you say there's a default? So now it's not Istio anymore. You're doing a more lightweight default
We have
implementation of
Yeah, we
Ingress
have we have in Knative we have something called Courier. That is a
Courier.
very little Envoy Ingress implementation, just enough to implement what Knative needs. Um, and that's very lightweight and very useful. But the other two options are Contour, which is very good, and Istio, that is very good. And you can
Okay.
add those, and then if you're using one of those two, then you can like even leverage all the other benefits or other features that Contour or Istio provides. For example, Istio provides a service mesh, and Contour provides other CRDs. So that's how you get
Excellent.
Knative Serving install. And then the next thing is deployment. So if you have a
All right.
container, you can just deploy it. And I think you have done this before. So you can use the easiest way to do it is using the KN CLI, where you
Uh-huh.
do KN service create. Yeah, we have KN, then the noun, like the object that you want to create, and then you pass it the
Mm-hmm.
container image that you want to. So it could be nginx, for example. You can do dash image
Okay.
nginx or rainbows. I think you wrote an application that spits out rainbows
Yes, I like rainbows. Nginx is very practical.
or
Rainbows is more
unicorns.
fun.
They're in the same.
Unicorns,
They're in the
cool.
same theme.
All right.
Okay, so that image unicorns is your code that was sitting in Git, right? Could be Go or Java,
Uh-huh.
that was built into a container and pushed to a
Yep.
container registry. That's Kubernetes
Love it.
101, right? You put the container, you put it in
Mm-hmm.
the registry, and you tell Kubernetes, hey, create me a
And
deployment with it
yeah, and the container is what's running in the
in the
pod
in
in
the pod, right?
Kubernetes.
Yep.
Yeah.
If you don't provide a port, like that unicorn is a web app and it's listening on a web port, then the default is
Mm-hmm.
8080. But if you can also specify the port. So if somebody was trying with
Mm-hmm.
nginx and having issues, it's because nginx, the one that is running as root runs in port 80. So they will have a
Uh-huh.
problem like it's not port 8080, but you can pass the flag says dash port 80 to tell the system, hey, nginx is going to listen on port 80, and it works out of the box. And that's something that we fixed kind of recently to make it easy to
Okay.
work with anything
To
like
do.
even temporary files. So they
So,
so this is when
okay.
this happens. Now Knative KN service create image unicorns. This
Mm-hmm.
will create for you under the hood two objects for Knative. One is the route and one is the configuration. Um,
Is the service itself an object?
a service is another object. Yeah.
Okay.
If you are familiar with Kubernetes, those are CRDs. So it's a custom resource. So you have a
Okay.
service, and you can put a little star in there saying like, this is a Knative service, This is not the Kubernetes
Yeah,
service,
you
and
know
this is
what?
something.
Man, that tripped me up when I was learning about Knative. I was like, I
Yeah,
don't understand. Where's this pod? Yeah, okay. I'm
yeah.
gonna
So
just do it
imagine
like that.
imagine if we call the deployment a service and the pod a service and then the service a service and then everything's a service. It's very confusing. So and also developers are not the best people to name things. That's our weakest point of naming variables or naming things. But this is a Knative service as for example, to the point that that first user of the API story, like the vendor, like I want to give you a container, you give me back a URL or a service. So that's the
Hmm.
point of Knative service is to get you to a URL. So you can put a dotted line from Knative service to URL. So that's the final
Okay.
goal of having a URL, and hopefully that URL will be HTTPS,
Okay.
right? So you
Yes.
go from
Yes.
one line, now you get to
Uh-huh.
HTTPS, and it covers all the things that we did about Kubernetes. So that just to go a little bit on the like how it works on under the hood for Knative service. When you create this
Uh-huh.
service, now let's before that, when you do this command, Knative will give
Hmm.
you back a URL that you can open your browser, um, and then your code is running like magic. Like that's it.
Wow.
There's nothing, and it could be
Bam.
HTTPS with a domain name. So that's the
Wow.
nirvana and the experience we want to get developers of, like, you give
Hmm.
me an image to a vendor or to Kubernetes,
Uh-huh.
and Kubernetes give you back a URL. That's the contract. I give you an image with my code.
Uh-huh.
Your contract give me a URL. What that if somebody visits that URL, my code runs and my app works.
Uh-huh.
And then if you use a cloud provider, or then you get billed. If nobody visits that URL, you don't get billed, and that's the magic of the serverless.
So, and that can happen because an administrator has set up all the cert stuff
Yeah.
when they made the service. Okay.
No,
Cool.
when they install
When they
Kubernetes, when they
Yes,
install
yeah.
Knative, when they install the
Knative.
administrator but went ahead and rented a Kubernetes cluster. He installed Knative Serving. He selected between Istio and Contour and Courier, and he
Or she.
configured, or she that she usually she uh did the cert manager, and she selected the domain name, and then that's the admin job, right? And the admin job probably worked with the DevOps person to set up a CI/CD pipeline, saying like, well, developers are going to create Git repos, Git repositories, and when they check in code, our CI/CD pipeline will run. The images will be signed, and they'll be pushed into a registry, and they're ready for them then to specify the Knative service.
And now our developer does not even have to think about it.
Yes, and that's it. And this is what the next thing that it does is I don't know if are we running out of time or not.
I don't have a time limit, but if you
Okay.
do,
No, I don't
okay.
have a time limit. I don't know how
Okay,
much time
great.
we needed to go with. So this is like with the mechanical sympathy, right? That we go
Uh-huh.
down into this
Yes.
rabbit hole. Because if you
Uh-huh.
leave it at this level, this is where like I want like the developers for her to scream, say like, "Oh my god, I got my unicorns in a web page, and the only thing
Woo!
that I had to do was give a container
Just
image."
one.
By the way, I
Yeah.
wasn't sure what an image was, but my friends that were in my team told me like checking the code in this GitHub repository,
Uh-huh.
and they already set up the thing to create me an image. And that could be another episode about CI/CD pipelines,
That
right? And we also
yeah,
have
yeah.
a function called kn-func, which helps you
Uh-huh.
build that image and deploy it. And that could be another episode. But right now,
Oh.
yeah, kn funk is another plugin that is, it takes code from your laptop and tries to build you an image either with a build pack or with Tecton and a build
Uh-huh.
pack, and get that image created. But there's so many ways of creating that image that people have
Uh-huh.
today that usually we don't talk about that much about getting an image.
Thanks, Armando. Armando says, "Yeah, this is awesome." So is the K and Funk, is that like part wrapped into the serving or the eventing or
Oh, it's a CLI plugin,
oh,
like
it's
Quick
just
Start. The KN has
okay,
multiple
got it.
plugins,
Got
and one
it.
of those plugins. So those plugins is to help a developer to
Uh-huh.
talk to the system. So we did it a composable way of like having plugins, and that way, if a developer wants to create their own plugin to do whatever they want, like for example, if they want to create a function that has unicorns, they can do it. Um, so they can do that. So now we go to the mechanical sympathy that I think Rick was mentioned on. Like
Yeah.
this is feels like too much magic, right? So if I run this command, I give you an image, and
Yeah.
by the way, you don't have to use the kn is like a sugar CLI, I call it. Like I like, we're talking about unicorns and sugar. I think by the end we'll be in Candyland. But kn is the sugar, is a sugar CLI that is
Uh-huh.
Knative aware. But you can do exactly that
Okay.
command. You can like have a passive parameter called dash dash target, and it will generate you the
Uh-huh.
YAML. So if you're a fan of YAML and Kubernetes, will give you back a piece of YAML that is almost like 9 lines of code, that is has
Uh-huh.
the name of the name of the service, and it has a section that says here's the image that you want to
Mm-hmm.
run. So it's a Knative service YAML, and then you can use
Mm-hmm.
kubectl or kubectl to apply that YAML, or have that
Amazing.
YAML, have it in a GitOps repository for Git repo, and have something like Flux CD or Argo CD, or like Carvel, right? From
Uh-huh.
Carvel, to watch a Git repo to create a Knative serving for you. So it's not
And
proprietary to a KNCLI. KNCLI is just a very easy way to get started, to get something working. The same thing as kubectl. A lot of people use
uh-huh.
kubectl. Hopefully, don't use them in Bash scripts. They use them like as something like to learn, but they eventually have the YAML or the Helm chart sitting in a Git repo or in a Helm repository.
Yeah.
Um,
It need to be declarative. So then it later, if you need to check on what you deployed earlier or need to reconfigure, you can consult that YAML.
Yeah, and then all the properties that are go along with the service, like for example, you can specify a volume. Now we have support for PVCs. You can specify a section of
Uh-huh.
that YAML, or you want to specify the port, or you want to specify. We can talk about traffic splitting in a bit. How to do traffic splitting? You can specify in that Knative. Um, but going for this, what this
Wait,
happens.
we have
Go ahead.
a comment. Abhishek says, this is the magic you were talking about earlier. Now we want to know, how does it work?
Yes. So the magic behind this is the Knative service then creates two objects underneath. One is called the route, that is going to be concerned with the URL and the traffic to that service, and then the other object is called the configuration, which will be concerned with things like environment variables, like the port, like I mentioned, the port number, and a PVC, that the properties of that pod. So it's usually attached to, if you want to see the one correlation, is a route will be associated with a service and an ingress, and a configuration will be associated with the pod specification. So things
Okay.
like the
Oh,
container image goes into a configuration, the port number, environment variables, things that go into a deployment spec for the pod spec.
okay.
So those
Nice.
things live
Okay.
in there. So when you create the first version, then 100% in the route goes to the first revision. So under a configuration, you can draw revision 1. So you just
Okay.
created the configuration, the first configuration, then that would create revision 1 of this service. And the idea is that these revisions are immutable, and you want to have
Oh, I love it.
immutability in a cloud native application or in Kubernetes, to make sure that that doesn't change on you. Like the software that you intend to run in production today, right now, is
Mm-hmm.
that version, and nobody can change it, or you're sure that that's the code that you're running, and it will create revision 1. So you will have a line from the route 100% to that revision 1.
So this
The
is our
traffic.
traffic, right?
Yeah. So traffic will come into the cluster through the route,
Through the
that's the
route,
URL. Yeah. They're
uh-huh, and the
representing the
ingress,
service.
right? You said?
Yeah,
Yeah.
through the ingress, and then
And
from the ingress we'll go to revision 1.
excellent. And then it's running?
And then revision 1 is going to create a deployment. That's
Oh.
where the deployments comes in.
How am I doing on the edge? Okay.
Yeah, you're
So here's
okay.
a deployment.
Yeah, it will create a deployment associated to that revision 1.
Okay. And then inside the deployment are pods.
There's a pod, and you can
Well, can be a pod because it's serverless, right?
so you can start with 0 pods, but the
Okay.
default case is you start with 1 pod. So you can draw 1 pod inside the deployment and draw it
Okay.
large enough to fit 2 containers, and that's also part of the magic. So
Let's
a pod,
do starter.
this would spin up a pod with 2 containers.
Okay. I already drew it wrong after you warned me. I'll get it. So what? We'll do 1 pod, 2 containers?
Yeah, just draw a box. That's a pod with 2 containers.
Pod. And then
And then you can one of the containers will be a U for user, and then another container will be for Q proxy.
oh, okay. You said Q, but okay.
U and Q,
I'm
two
good. U and
containers.
Q, user and Q proxy.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
So that's a
So this is
pod.
our pod, and we have a container for user and a container for Q proxy.
Q proxy.
Cool.
Because people wanted to know the magic, right? So we're going to tell them
Yeah, I'm loving this.
how we make the
I
sausage.
love this so much. Yeah.
So, and like, why 2 containers? So if you look at the normal way of Kubernetes was 1 container, and this one we have 2. So that container that is in the regular normal Kubernetes is the user container. So that same user container, your image will be the U. The Q.
And so that's where the application is running.
That's the application. So that's the user container listening on port 8080, and then you have the Q on it, and then below the deployment, what we have is an autoscaler, the Knative autoscaler. So you can draw a autoscaler below the deployment box and call it the autoscaler. So that autoscaler.
You know what the U also stands for in the container? It's unicorns.
Unicorn, yes, that's where we store our unicorns in a container.
Yeah.
So the reason is now you have 1 pod. And the way the autoscaler works is autoscaler, you can draw a line from the autoscaler to the Q proxy. So the Q proxy is a sidecar that Knative adds to your pod to help with the autoscaling, and also the concurrency, to limit the concurrency, and also to check if your port is listening on 8080. It's like ready to receive traffic. So one of the things that the autoscaler works is if by default Knative works on concurrency. So the way it scales more pods is if you start hitting traffic coming into that pod, you will get to, it can process multiple requests at the same time. So we call that concurrency. So 100 people, 100 requests come exactly at the same time. All 100 requests are being processed in the same pod, in the same container, all at the same time. If more traffic comes in, the default configuration, like you have too much traffic, like you have too much concurrency on this, you need another pod. So the queue is watching like how many concurrent requests are being processed, like 50, 70, 80. So there's a window of calculation, and the autoscaler is getting the metrics from the autoscaler gets the metrics from the Q proxy, to the point that it says we don't have that, it's going over the limit of that concurrency. We need another pod. So basically the autoscaler tells the deployment, create a new pod, because the Q proxy is telling me that this container is hot. It has too much traffic.
So the Q proxy is watching the concurrency, and then the autoscaler is doing what? Remind me.
Is scraping the metrics, that concurrency from the queue. And if from every pod. So if you have N pods, the autoscaler is getting the metrics from every pod. to see if the average is very high and it needs more pods. So it's
So
the autoscaler is also talking to the deployment, telling it to go to 1, going to 2, going to 3. So it's the similar thing if you go to Kubernetes, go to the deployment
uh-huh,
and manually set the replica to 2, and it then set it to 3, and then set it to 4. So the autoscaler is talking to the deployment to change the
uh-huh.
number of replicas based on the metrics that the queue proxy is seeing on those containers, on those pods.
This is fascinating. I'm loving this.
There's a question
Uh,
in.
yes, that's what I was going to say too. How much are the resources allocated to this pod? That's a
So
great
there,
question.
so the resources, since in the service, I mentioned that it was a YAML. You can allocate the resources the same way you do in Kubernetes. So the Kubernetes has something called resources limit and request. You're
Uh-huh.
requesting one CPU, but setting the limit to 5, so it will not go more than 5. Or so if that's a Kubernetes concern, you do it the same way as Kubernetes.
Okay. And then more specifically, Abhishek wants to know how much CPU and memory to allocate to this pod initially. How does Knative know in the first place how much to give it?
You do it the same way as Kubernetes. Correct. Knative is not concerned with that. You as the administrator configuring these pods,
Mm-hmm.
if the same way you decide how to do it in Kubernetes without Knative, it's the same way that you
Mm-hmm.
do it in Knative. So Knative, as you saw, it's just doing what you were doing manually, or maybe with the horizontal autoscaler to do it manually,
Mm-hmm.
to do it with the autoscaler. So the autoscaler is based on
So,
concurrency. So you have to do that. At the end, the end of the answer is kind of like you test. So you
uh-huh.
deploy this, you send it fake traffic, and then you watch how much CPU and memory it consumes with a normal workload, and then you set your limits, right? You set your requests and you set your limits for the deployment for the pod.
Uh-huh. And the administrator who sets up the cluster can set defaults for pods on a
Yes.
namespace.
Yeah. Yeah. Or
Yeah.
quota saying like, I don't want
Quota.
developers to
Mm-hmm.
allocate 10 CPUs for these pods, right? You can have
Yeah.
policies based on Kubernetes. So that's the beauty of Knative Serving is we get a lot of questions on how to do things, and our standard is not that we want to be jerks. It's like the standard answer that we give back is like, you do it the same way you do it as Kubernetes. Like, this is not a Knative
Uh-huh.
thing, right? Um, I'm
I
sorry
don't
for I did see the YAML file for. Did I miss something or is part of the code? Yeah, so the YAML, we did it here with the KNC Alliance. So there's a YAML behind it being created for you. But you can skip the KN service and just write the YAML. So because we're doing this live and we don't have a code editor, we can show the YAML. But I promise you, there's a lot of YAML to go around for everyone. So yeah, there's a YAML that you put at the top. This is a Knative service. Then you say pod template spec, and then usually you put things that you put for the pod, like the image, the port number, the liveness probe, the readiness probe, any PVCs, environment variables, resource limits and requests, anything that you're used to putting in the YAML that you put in a deployment, you will put it in the Knative service. So good question.
So yeah, great question. I'm going to repeat what's happening here to make sure I understand. So the traffic hits the root through the URL and the ingress, just the root, makes it go to the revision. And the revision is what creates the deployment or is associated with the deployment.
Yep.
And the deployment will have pods. And those pods will have two containers. One container is running your application, and the other container is watching the amount of concurrent requests coming into that pod.
Yeah.
And then the autoscaler is getting all of the information from all of the concurrency of all of the active pods at that moment and aggregating those metrics and using that to talk to the deployment about how many pods should be spun
Yeah.
up at that time.
So the
Cool.
autoscaler will go and say, I need pot number 2. And it will create pot number 2 because you have too much currency. And you as a
Yeah.
developer, here's the thing. A lot of systems that are serverless are called functions as a service. And some of those
Uh-huh.
systems, for some reason or for a good reason or a bad reason, developers set the concurrency to 1. So sometimes they want to
Uh-huh.
process one request on the container at the same time, not 100. It could be for
Mhm.
whatever reason. It could be like that single request is allocating a lot of memory. So if you have like two or
Mhm.
three, then your pod goes out of memory and it crash. So the queue proxy
Okay.
it actually buffers, make sure that one request is done before sending the other one. So it's kind of like making sure that concurrency is met in the container. So you can have a soft target or hard target for it. So you can set
Mhm.
it to one, and when the next
Mhm.
request comes in, the queue proxy will buffer it, but it gets to a point that you actually need a second pod because you're getting too many, and the second, the third, maybe the third or fourth request goes to the second pod, and so on. So the autoscaler is giving you more pods based on the 100 is just the default, but you can set it to one, and that will behave in a similar way as the functions as a service like Lambda or OpenWhisk and those type of things that
Mhm.
are one request. The drawback is you're not going to have a lot of throughput. You're not going to manage a lot of things at the same time. So that's the benefit
Mhm.
of if you use a programming language or you write your program in a way that you can have multi concurrency working at the same time all those requests, then you can have a single pod process a ton of requests at the same time, and that means you pay less because you don't have that many pods, and you can fit more applications for the whole team instead of having a cluster with 16 nodes. You have a cluster with 3 nodes, right? So that's where the
Uh-huh.
density, when we talk about, I like to talk about the density of Knative Serving brings is
Okay.
you're actually like leveraging all those nodes because they're being used,
Uh-huh.
and actually if you do multi concurrency, that actually you're processing as much as possible on one container. So going back to the
Yeah.
autoscaler, so if you have a lot of traffic coming in,
Uh-huh.
you get another pod. What happens when
Mhm.
traffic stops?
I can guess based on what we've talked on before. It can scale to zero. It can go
You
away.
scale to zero. So the autoscaler said like pod three went away. Woof, I don't have metrics. Pod two went away. Woof, I still have no metrics. And pod and then and the last pod, the queue proxy says like there's no more traffic autoscaler. And then you have different knobs. You can say maybe wait 60 seconds, maybe wait an hour. But
Okay.
it already generated an event saying like this is scaled to zero, and the
Mhm.
autoscaler saying like, well, I think no traffic have come for a while, let's scale to zero, and that last spot disappears. So and then you
Uh-huh.
don't, if you are kind of building your own solution, then you should not be charging folks. If you're a nice good
So,
citizen, not saying that you have to
uh-huh.
do it, don't charge folks if you're not actually using the system. Like there's no pods, like that's the time to not charge people. And in Knative we have an experimental flag that you can actually have an event from that queue proxy trigger saying scales to zero, scale from zero, and that way you can do kind of billing also, internal billing for your things.
Mhm.
But the going back is like autoscaler is watching those pods, and it will go to
Mhm.
zero, and then you don't have any pods. So what happens
Mhm.
now? Imagine if we raise the pod, the autoscaler is not watching, there's no traffic
Mhm.
in, and then tonight
Mhm.
there's new traffic in. How do we go from zero to one?
So the when the traffic comes in, I don't know because if the pod is how the autoscaler is getting information, then how does the autoscaler know or anybody know to make a new one?
So in Knative, we have a component called the activator. So
The
you like
activator.
our names? We have the
I
autoscaler,
do.
we have the revision route configuration service, and now we have, you can draw a box next to the autoscaler or below below the
Okay.
autoscaler because we're going to do revision too. So we have the activator, and that's a component that is shared across all namespaces. It's a group of activators. It's usually based on how much traffic you're going to have and so on. But it's a component. It's a
So,
data path. It's a network component in there that if there's no pods available, Knative has the configuration. The system has the configuration to switch the toggle, saying like now revision the traffic should not go directly to revision one and the pod because there's no stable traffic. Now there's a toggle that magically happens, and then now the traffic
uh-huh.
goes to the activator. So when that
Uh-huh.
request come in, it's from the
Oh.
route goes directly to the activator. So you can draw a line
Oh,
from the route to the activator,
Well,
And
before I do that, I have a question about where the activator sits. Like, did you say it's a namespace scoped resource? So it's not associated with this revision.
it's associated with a group of revision. Yeah, it's associated with you can have 3 activators, and then each one is watching different Knative services. So it's a shared
Okay.
component. It's
So the
not directly.
activator's almost above the
Yeah, it's
Knative
a
service. If I
controller.
had room to draw it, it's
Yeah, it's a
okay.
controller like Knative service. When you install it, there's different controllers. One is the main
Okay.
controller, another is the webhook, and this one on the autoscaler is another one, and then
I'm
the
gonna put it.
activator. But I would draw it with this service,
Okay, you
and
want it
just
down here?
assume
Okay,
that,
I trust
yeah.
you.
So
Okay.
because it plays a role, even if it's a shared
Okay.
component. He knows about revision 1, and he's configured for revision 1, or for this
Okay.
service.
So
So
let's
the
talk
route
about brand new traffic coming in.
Yeah, so brand new traffic comes in, and we're like, there's 0 pods.
Uh-huh. And so it's come to the root and it's come to the revision
No, it doesn't
and
hit the
there's zero.
revision.
It doesn't hit the revision. So it comes into the root and
Well,
there's
yeah, you
zero
can. Let's
pods.
let's go to the revision. I'm sorry, that you draw it correctly. Let's try to the revision, because
Okay.
the route needs to know, like, where is this traffic for, and we can talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that. So the route or the ingress knows that it's for revision 1 based on the host name. So based on the
Okay.
host name, it knows that it needs to go to the latest revision of the service. So it go to revision
Okay.
1, but instead of going directly to the pod, goes to the activator, like we were
Uh-huh.
going to draw it.
Then it's like, yeah. So then it goes to the activator. And then
And then the
the
activator needs
activator
to
will spin.
and then the activator needs to tell someone, hey, give me scale the pod to 1. Who would that be, that
Uh-huh.
person that is in charge of scaling
This is gonna
pods?
work. Mm-hmm. It, who? So the autoscaler's in charge of scaling pods,
Yes.
of telling the deployment. Yeah. Cool.
You can be
So the
you can be a
activator.
Knative contributor already. See? So yeah, dude, you have it correctly. Like,
So
draw a line
I
from
did have it
revision
correctly, but
1.
I just wanted to leave myself room to draw revision two
Okay.
later.
Yeah.
And then the activator is like, yo, we need a pod. And so the activator tells the autoscaler, and the autoscaler is like, yo, we need a pod. And then it tells the deployment, right? And then deployment still spins up a pod and it knows how to do that.
Yeah.
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 Cool. And Abhishek got it too. Autoscaler. You can contribute with me, Abhishek.
So
Cool.
that's kind of like, you can do all these things with Kubernetes and do it manually, right? Like, write a little bash
Uh-huh.
script, and then, or do it manually, or write. You can write something like a metric server for a custom metric server for the HPA. So instead of memory CPU is traffic, but somebody needs to see that traffic. So maybe you can attach to the ingress, and people have done that. But that solution is like one-off solution, and then the second. So what with
Mm-hmm.
Knative, what we're trying to do is to make it a generic or standard, or a way that satisfies a lot of use cases, so everybody
Mm-hmm.
start using it, and it becomes like native to Kubernetes. And you install Kubernetes, and usually you have these all the packages that you always install, because it's like, we're going to then up doing this, either we're going to do it manually or we're going to do it automation. And but
Mm-hmm.
Knative doesn't change the game of how Kubernetes works. You still have a deployment,
Mm-hmm.
same rules apply. You have a deployment, you have a pod, the same rules apply, and you have a
Mm-hmm.
service, and the same rules apply. So,
This is
um,
so cool, Carlos. I'm so excited. I'm having such a nice time. Okay.
So the next thing is like 100%. We can talk about traffic split. So I think we cover everything about auto scaling. There's a lot of knobs that you can go into the documentations, and like, how much is the window to calculate the metrics.
Uh-huh.
The activator is in the middle of the network when traffic is start coming in to the point that you have a
Uh-huh.
stable window. And then on the stable windows, the activator says, I'm out of the picture because you have enough pod to satisfy the traffic. So it's like a living system. And then when traffic started
Uh-huh.
going back down, activator comes into the picture to make sure that the idea is like no request gets dropped. And that's very difficult. Like, no single request gets dropped. So the activator actually like hosts the request, tells the pod to come up, and it waits for that pod to come up. So the activator is probing
Uh-huh.
the pods, like, Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you
Ah,
ready to take traffic? And it will start sending the traffic from the activator to the queue proxy, and then from the queue proxy to the user. So the traffic doesn't go directly to the container user, it goes through the queue proxy. I think I didn't mention
okay.
that. And then
Ah,
that request goes from the queue proxy to the user container,
cool.
because it needs to know
We have,
like the request coming in. Do I send it to the container or not, because of the concurrency? So if you say that you're going to handle only 5 or around 5 and you have 7, then the queue proxy it's a queue, so it's going to queues 2 of them until like you have enough another one, and again give the other one in. Without Kubernetes, it's like you get everything in. Like there's no queue or watching if the things are ready, or when you go scale to 0 to make sure that everything is drained. So that's kind of like there's a lot of corner cases and
yeah.
paper cuts that when you go into
Uh-huh.
production with Kubernetes at scale, it's like it's not a 100% perfect system, and that's where you start doing tweaks. So we try to put those tweaks into a Knative project.
We have a question from Abhishek. Does new traffic request remain with the root until the pod comes up to live state, or is it the activator's responsibility to route it to the application?
Yeah, so like I said, the traffic goes to the activator, and it
Mm-hmm.
it tells the autoscaler to go to give me a pod, but it takes time for that
Mm-hmm.
pod to come up, takes time for the user
Mm-hmm.
container to come up, the queue process to come up. So the activator is watching that pod can take the traffic, and it will start sending it. It basically proxy the request from the activator to the queue proxy to the user, to the point that if you have enough
Mm-hmm.
traffic and you have a stable window, then it goes to a state that activator says like code like traffic should not come through me. You have enough pods to handle it,
Mm-hmm.
and then again the networking
Okay.
switches again, toggles back, and it goes directly to the pods, and then activator is
That
out of
makes
the
a lot of
picture.
that makes me think of a question. When there's zero pods and you get brand new traffic, how long does it take for a pod to come up? I imagine it's slower than if a pod is already running.
So you're talking about the famous or infamous cold start.
A cold
in
start.
Yeah, so in
Yeah.
serverless, if you are around like a community of serverless nerds like me, and you come and we open our circle, say like welcome Whitney, come in. Most of them will be talking for an hour like, oh, the cold start, how do we solve the cold start problem, how do we solve the cold start problem? Because when you visit the website, it's like nothing's happening, because you're telling Kubernetes give me a pod, and Kubernetes like deciding like
Yeah.
I have 500 nodes. Which node do I select? And then tell the kubelet to create a pod, and the kubelet trying to figure out with the CNI like give me an IP address for this pod. Okay, you have an IP
Uh-huh.
address. Oh, the user selected that he wanted IPv0. Let me get storage, and then the person still waiting in the web page like, is this thing going to like give me a web page? So it can take
Yeah.
up to 5 seconds, for example, or 4 seconds, or it can take 1 second. But we make it
Okay.
so we try to make, and that's where like I was saying the paper cuts come in. You can have
Mm-hmm.
different, so there's no one solution to the cold start, because there's multiple factors that contribute to that time. But there's a lot of things
Mm-hmm.
that you can do to make that down. And actually, we have a talk in Knative Con in EU
Mm-hmm.
that will be talking about the different things that we are doing, and we want the community to help out developers to come help us write some code, come up with ideas on how do we solve the cold start. But right now, some of the strategies is if you're using, for example, a Java application. So that's something
Uh-huh.
like a developer can help with. If you're using
Mm-hmm.
a Java application is JVM, so it takes a few seconds or maybe 15 seconds to come up. You can use
Uh-huh.
something like GraalVM and Quarkus to compile to native. So now it goes down to 200 milliseconds. Another one
Okay.
is pre-caching the images. So those images that you have in
Okay.
there in Knative, we have an API that we can tell the system, we can tell a controller, if you have a controller, saying like, hey,
Uh-huh.
I deployed this Knative service right now in this node. The other
Uh-huh.
49 nodes don't have the image. Can you go ahead and
Uh-huh.
recache that image? Because if the pod gets requested, they doesn't have to spend time downloading the image.
Yeah.
So they downloading
Uh-huh.
the image, it could be like 2 seconds. So now you reduce it to 0. Another
So
one is
I have a question in that scenario. Are you trying to cache it on all 50 nodes? Or are you trying to make sure if it gets spun up again, it goes to that node that has the cache?
because that's a concern with Kubernetes.
Uh-huh.
We don't control how Kubernetes
Okay,
put
good.
it, so we
That
just
makes a lot
put
of
it
sense.
in all nodes and make
All of
sure
them.
that
Okay.
and that's a plugin aspect that somebody can plug into Knative with that
Uh-huh.
API, and there's implementation in open source for that. So pre-caching images is a strategy. Reducing
Okay.
the your
Cool.
code is another one. Making your image small, right? Sometimes a lot of people are
Mm-hmm.
just install a lot of dependencies and even the tools. So using like multi-stage
Uh-huh.
Docker files to just install
Uh-huh.
distro-less images, like very tiny images, or maybe using a different language, like it's compiled language,
Uh-huh.
like interpreted language. And another one is things that we are have open in Kubernetes space to make the kubelet spin up that pod or that contain between the kubelet and the CNI and the container runtime. All of them are doing work to make sure that that container comes up fast, but also checking that is because sometimes it's up and fast, but the things that check that is ready, it takes like some
Uh-huh.
loops, like it takes another second to check. So if we can short
Uh-huh.
circuit those checks, it could come like
Uh-huh.
in milliseconds, for example. So that's something
Okay.
to keep in mind that maybe you may need to have some services min scale. So that's also part of the auto scaling. You can set
Mm.
the minimum scale to 1 or 2 to always have like
Mm-hmm.
one container hot
Yeah.
for that traffic. And maybe some
Uh-huh.
applications it's okay to have one minimum or 2 pods available and not scale to
Uh-huh.
0, right? But having the benefit of specifying the YAML with 10 lines instead of like 10 lines for a cert manager, 10 lines for the ingress, 10 lines for the service, 10 lines for the deployment,
Yeah.
having 40
Uh-huh.
lines. That's a benefit that you can get even if you're not scaling to 0. And another one is and configuring the HTTPS and all that. Another benefit is
Uh-huh.
concurrency. Sometimes you want to
Mm-hmm.
have scaling based on concurrency,
Oh.
even from one to many or many to one, and you benefit from that, and you don't have to go to 0.
And how does the scaling happen in a Kubernetes deployment?
The scaling in
Like
Kubernetes
compute?
deployment, yeah,
Yeah.
CPU usage and memory
Compute.
usage
Mm-hmm.
on the pods that
Okay.
you have. So it will be
Uh-huh.
similar. So in that case, you're like leveraging Kubernetes. It will work as a regular Kubernetes deployment,
Mm-hmm.
but you get the benefits of like the simplification of the abstraction of just specifying a service,
Mm-hmm.
and everything else takes care of it. So
Cool.
it's a trade-off. It always
Wonderful.
depends on your application, and then things that
Yeah.
you can do to your application or to the system to help with optimizations for that famous cold start.
So to take all of that wonderful explanation about a cold start and boil it down, what I'm hearing is at this moment, it could take up to 4 or 5 seconds, but the community is very interested in this problem and getting that number down.
Yeah,
And there are other ways you can make it smaller too.
yeah,
Great.
that's an extreme. Like nothing is catch. Your system is slow. Your application is kind of
Uh-huh.
big. You haven't done any optimization, right? And that
Okay.
that could be that high. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what's the next? We wanted to talk about traffic splitting, you said.
Yes.
So I
So we
guess the
already talked.
question is, what if we update our image? Yeah.
So that's when it happens. So I think we already talked about the simplification of the YAML. So the Knative service is like a very small YAML to get
Uh-huh.
you up and running, and you don't have the risk of usually in Kubernetes you have to specify a YAML for the service and a YAML for the deployment, and there's like you put some label selectors, and then you're when you do the third one, like there's so much boilerplate of putting the labels here and putting the labels over here and putting the labels in the third place. And then people
Uh-huh.
ask like, why do I have like the same word in 3 places in 2 YAML files? Why not like here's an image, just give me a URL, right? So that
Uh-huh.
was one of the
Yeah.
benefits of having the abstraction to one. So if we update that YAML or we do a Knative service update and we want to update, for
Mm-hmm.
example, an environment variable, that's a very simple
Mm-hmm.
example. An environment variable will
Mm-hmm.
be associated with a configuration. So you're changing
Mm-hmm.
the configuration on the service by changing an environment variable from one value to another value. That will create
Mm-hmm.
revision 2. and that's a be a second revision immutable for that Knative service configuration. So the new version, your new version of the app with the environment variable could be a configuration. It could be an image. It could be like you do your unicorns. You add it. You paint your
Mm-hmm.
unicorns with rainbow colors. So now we have the rainbow, the unicorn V2, for example. Um,
Yes.
but but maybe you don't want to. We can talk about this. Maybe you don't want to share it with everyone in the world. Maybe you want to do a beta of it.
Okay.
So what you can do is you can tell this revision 2 saying tag it, give it a tag. So you can say kn
Mm-hmm.
service update tag revision 2 with, let's say, v2 or beta, or or
Oops. Okay.
or you can say v2, that's okay. V2.
Okay.
So if you add a tag to this traffic v2, Knative has automatically will create you a unique URL that is the same URL as the
Oh.
service, but it starts with v2 dash, and then the rest is the same. So now you have two URLs, one that
Okay.
is the service, the service URL, and another one that is
Uh-huh.
specific to v2.
Uh-huh.
And that's a very good benefit for people that are trying to roll out software, because now you have a URL, you have two URLs, the one that everybody in
Uh-huh.
the public is using and is using the revision one, and then you have a tag with a second one that you're not sending any traffic, could be, right? So if you do a normal update, 100% of the traffic goes to version 2. So for example, if you update the image, or you update we make it very simple, like
Okay.
you as a developer, maybe you're doing testing, like, yeah, update the image, revision 2, you update the mission,
Mm-hmm.
revision 3, revision
Bam.
4, 100% goes to the latest revision. But if I want
Mm-hmm.
to try to explain like a custom use case where maybe
Mm-hmm.
you painted your unicorns yellow, or you're trying things, right?
Uh-huh.
Or maybe you paint it with
Yeah.
rainbow colors and you want to only tell
Yeah.
your friends about, hey, can you give a task to my unicorn to see if the rainbow colors are, good or like
Come check
horrible.
out this super secret rainbow
Yeah.
unicorn,
So you
friend.
you
Yeah.
Slack them, or in Discord you send them the URL to V2, and that way they can
Uh-huh.
do testing, right? For you to say like, oh, the app
Yeah.
is it start even faster. What you did to it? Oh, I just remove 100 megs of dependencies. Oh, and by the way, I love the colors of these V2 beta rainbow things. When are everybody's going to see them? So that V2, and
Uh-huh.
you can even do testing or security testing. Like in normal enterprise software, you have to do testing when you're going to roll out something. So that's like a kind of, it's not that secret, but it's a secret URL that you can give folks, and then they can directly,
Uh-huh.
now traffic goes to that URL, to the route, and it hits
So
revision 2.
so it still goes to the same route. The Knative service is still only associated with one route, but this route knows that it's also looking for URL, another URL.
Yeah, in
Is
the
that what
host
I'm
name.
hearing?
Yeah, in the host name now has two host names associated with this service. The normal one,
Uh-huh.
which is the latest, and then this special one that has a V2 in front of it.
In
So
fact,
now
I'll
when you
make
visit that
this
host
better.
name, that domain name, for example, with V2 in the
Uh-huh.
front, now it hits V2. But everyone else keeps running to version 1. So when you do the update, you have to make sure that 0% goes to version 2, 100% still goes to version 1.
Okay.
So you can put
So
0%
anything.
to revision 2 with a line, and then put 100% in the revision 1.
Mm, so this is a V2 URL. I'm going to put it like it goes in here and through the V2
Yeah.
and then down there.
That way, and some other folks call this canary testing, right? You're
Uh-huh.
doing a
I've
canary
heard that.
testing to make sure that the users will like your new version before you release it to everyone.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I don't see, everyone loves the rainbows. How did you make it more efficient and add more colors? It's
Yes.
magical.
So
Hmm.
once your friends, right, give you feedback, and you pass the test
Uh-huh.
saying this is awesome, like you have to roll it out as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So then you can say, well, I want to gradually roll it out. I don't want to go 100% out. I want to
Uh-huh.
gradually roll it out. So maybe you can put some shell scripts, or you have the CI/CD pipeline, you have some automation, or something like Spinnaker or Argo CD, or something that updates. Now you can do an update on the service, but don't change the configuration. You'll be doing a change in the YAML, in the section of the
Uh-huh.
YAML that is traffic, or the CLI. You can say dash dash traffic, or in the
Uh-huh.
YAML you have a section that says traffic, that says, it says now 100% to revision 1, 0% to revision 2. Now you can
Uh-huh.
erase it and say, I'm going to send 50%.
I have a question about that. Does I'm now we're saying we want our main traffic to come in, not with the V2 tag, right?
Oh yes, yes, that's correct. So now when people visit the main domain name, I
Uh-huh.
want to do a gradual rollout. So maybe what you and me we talk about, like, my friends like the rainbows. I'm not sure
Yeah.
that everyone will like the rainbows. So
Yeah.
let's see if we send it. Let's say, do you have a million users, right,
Uh-huh.
that love unicorns? And let's say that we're going to
Uh,
send it. We're going to send only the new version to half of the users, to 500,000 users, and the other half
uh-huh.
million users keep using seeing the old unicorns. And we'll see
Yeah.
Twitter, if Twitter goes viral saying they hate the rainbow unicorns, or they love the rainbow unicorns. So
Yeah.
now you can update the YAML or the CLI, and you can say 50% to revision 1 and 50%
Uh-huh.
to revision 2. So you can erase 100
So
and 100 0 and put 50/50.
so I can leave this special V2 tag and it'll still hit
Oh yeah,
revision
yeah. Your
2.
friends
But
still just,
meanwhile,
yep.
okay. But
So
meanwhile, we're also going to change the traffic, the main traffic, for
yeah,
half of it to
for your
go.
million users that are have the domain name, the regular domain name, now
Mm-hmm.
certain folks will start seeing the rainbows, and certain folks will not see the rainbows. And if
Okay.
people are joining and didn't have a background, I
Um,
think they'll be in the chat talking about rainbows.
It's recorded. You can watch it later.
Yeah.
So then, yeah, so then 50/50, but this going through the V2 is no longer accurate. So
Yeah,
we're talking more like,
and you can choose to just delete the tag. Like, I'm okay. Let's delete the tag
mm,
V2, and then your friends,
okay,
if they try to use V2, they don't. You can tell them, oh, just
yeah,
the regular one. You may get
just
the rainbows, you
refresh.
may
You'll
not
get
get
it
the rainbows.
eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um. So now, and then tell them,
Yeah,
like,
I will
you're
see this.
free
I
to,
like exploring.
put in Twitter if you like the rainbows or not. Like, the
Yeah.
embargo of my beta version is off.
Yeah.
Um. So now it's 50/50. And then what do? We just go
Uh-huh.
to Twitter to see, like, if you just post something like, hey,
Just
I just released rainbows for certain of my users. Tell me what you think.
uh-huh.
And then people will start saying, hey,
Uh-huh.
I don't see the rainbows. Oh, I just saw them. Or people will say,
Uh-huh.
I love the rainbows. I was lucky enough to get the rainbows, and I love it.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
everybody should get rainbows, or unicorn with rainbows.
Uh-huh.
And then it's like,
Yeah.
okay, tomorrow we're going to make it live 100%. So
Uh-huh.
now you make it, now you erase 50%, you give 0% to, uh and then what, all this traffic is coming in, pods are coming up and down, right? um
Yes.
so
So
now
that's what we're
revision
saying is
1.
like all of this deployment stuff is also happening associated with revision
Yeah,
2.
so revision
They
2
all,
has a
yeah.
deployment 2 with the pods with 2, and an
It has
activator
its own
watching that.
autoscaler.
So auto
Mm-hmm.
scaler, everything. So now that we with 0% revision 1, everyone gets the unicorns with rainbows. Revision 1 still
Yeah.
is a good revision. It's still available there, just in case in the weekend there's a problem with revision 2, like the colors
Uh-huh.
start going crazy, and they all go like invisible. You want to roll back to
Uh-huh.
revision 1, so you should keep revision 1 for a while there, just in case we want to roll back. Or it could be like, when you added rainbows, you added an npm package called rainbows, and that has a CVE, has a
Uh-huh.
security risk,
Oh.
and people are getting hacked. So you want to go to
Uh-huh.
revision 1. So let's keep
Uh-huh.
revision 1, just in case. But the
Yeah.
pods associated to revision 1, now they scale to 0. Like, the definition
Mm-hmm.
of the deployment is there, the definition of the app is there for revision 1, but it scales to 0. In Kubernetes, you
Mm-hmm.
will need to have 2 deployments, and then decide manually, set the replica count to 0 on deployment 1, set
Okay.
the other one, and then maybe disable the HPA, go disable the HPA. Like, I don't want more pods in deployment 1, and then deployment 2 is the one. So you have to this all orchestration versus all
Uh-huh.
Knative Serving is like automatically for you doing what you expect.
So the problem of go like if we introduce a CVE in our rainbows, the problem of going back to revision 1 is a much easier problem to solve in Knative than it would be in Kubernetes.
Yep. So it's as easy now that you can run a command line says Knative service 100% traffic to revision 1, done. In
Bam.
Or you go to GitHub and update the YAML saying 0% to revision 1, 0% to revision 2, and then something like GitOps would deploy it, or Carvel or Argo or Flux would eventually deploy it, and then that's it. That's the immutability. That's why you can go back to the revision 1,
Cool.
because it was immutable. Nobody messed with that image. And then with Knative, what it does on top of it, when you deploy an image with an image tag, Knative by
Uh-huh.
default is very pedantic that we don't like tags. We go ahead and
Uh-huh.
convert that tag. We resolve that tag into a digest. So we actually use the
Uh-huh.
image digest. So even if somebody
Okay.
messed with the tags in the container registry,
Mm-hmm.
we are using the
Yeah.
digest from revision 1.
Uh-huh.
And people are like, that's very good. You saved my butt because somebody changed the tag of the thing that we were using and pushed something else by mistake,
Yeah.
um and go to
Humans,
revision 1.
humans, man. Yeah. We have a question for you. Um, root is a software router and a configuration is some kind of service or pod. How do those elements work in the background? So we
So
kind of talked about
yeah,
that. Yeah.
we already described that. So the root, I'm calling it route, maybe I'm calling it incorrectly. Route is just a
I don't think.
CRD. Is an object, is an abstraction that is used to configure the actual ingress implementation, contour, istio, courier, to switch those numbers. So when you put 100, 100%, 0%, you're changing those things. The URL, Knative is using the information from the route to go ahead and configure or create objects for. We have a plugin system to configure istio contour, like the network traffic, and then configuration is also like a abstraction. It's a configuration. Configuration is a configuration. It's an abstraction in Kubernetes. It's a CR. It's not actually like the pod, but eventually we'll create the revision, and the revision will create the pods, and the pods actually the one that handle the traffic. It's like the compute something running.
Cool.
So yeah, good to review that. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And did we cover everything about the how the sausage is made, as you said?
Let me see. So we have revision 1. We did traffic splitting.
Uh-huh.
We did
Uh-huh.
rollout. Um,
Rollback. Yeah.
yeah. So the other thing that we have features in Knative Serving is it's a very small feature just to get feedback from the community, and also to show other people that are implementing Knative, like to implement their more advanced methods. But we have something called
Mm-hmm.
duration. So you can configure
Duration.
a duration when you update. Let's say you update the service, and now rainbows, we add something else to the unicorns. We can add
Uh-huh.
wings, right? So we're going to add
Yeah.
wings or
It's a
bigger wings.
Pegasus now.
It's a
Yes.
Pegasus, right? So we're going to add wings
Yeah.
to our unicorn. So we're going to create revision 3, and you can draw revision 3. And when we
Okay.
update that, we can configure Kubernetes Knative to say a duration. So you can say, because, and this is a use case when you have a lot of like big traffic coming in, and you have to go from 0 to 100% very fast. Let's say that you need that revision 2 is using 1,000 pods, like something very drastic, and you're doing like
Okay.
15,000 requests per second. If you go and to revision 3 like right away, you're not going to get
Uh-huh.
a
1,000.
1,000 pods immediately to happen from magic, right? Then you will
Yeah.
start hitting like some network errors, like you don't have pods ready, the queue start like getting bigger, you cannot queue or buffer that much, and that's where like the corner case is like, why we have some errors when we go to 100. So you can tell the Knative saying, well, take a day, for example, 24 hours, or
Uh-huh.
8 hours. Say
Oh.
it
Uh-huh.
8 hours, go from
So,
0 to 100 to revision 3, and take your time. And
uh-huh.
that way you can gradually go divide the time of those, let's say 10 hours. You can go in 10 hours, every minute or every hour will do 10%. unto the point that it's 100. So that's a gradual rollout update that then you take
Mm-hmm.
into account. You can get to 1,000 pods, and then the other
Mm-hmm.
all 1,000 pods will gradually go down. And also that's also very good because maybe you don't have enough nodes or capacity to handle like almost 2,000 pods running at the same time, all of them, right? So you will have
Mm-hmm.
a lot of pods that are going to be pending, looking for memory or CPU. So you can configure a duration, and then that's a practice that cloud providers do. We just don't talk a lot
Cool.
about it, but because we
Uh-huh.
run services at
Because you're
scale,
too
right?
busy talking about cold starts, right? You don't have time to talk about duration.
Yeah. So you say we're going to be conservative, and maybe in this region, right, in the Europe versus East
Uh-huh.
Coast versus West Coast, we're going to start doing this rollout based on region and based on the amount of traffic we're getting, or based on the amount of traffic that we need, so we can fully utilize all these things. And if you do your software gradually, you constantly like shipping code. You know, take a week to ship code. Maybe you ship code every day.
Mm-hmm.
Big companies ship every code every minute, every hour. So the
Mm-hmm.
delta should be small, and you have this gradual rollout. You can say every hour, like just take an hour to just roll out this many pods to the new revision, and that's a duration. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a very small feature of Knative that we're still getting feedback, but just to show the art of the possible, right? For people that
Yeah.
actually hating these issues, so we can say, yeah, you solve that through this pattern called the duration, and you can have your own controller. You have Go developers just write an operator that handles the rollout, and then you just manage the revisions. Like we give you the revision, just you just adjust that 0%, 1%, 2%, and watch the metrics, right, to see if there's any 500
Uh-huh.
errors. The activator will be watching if there's any errors coming back, and it say like, oh, I'm
Uh-huh.
going too fast. Let me slow down, and it will watch.
Ah,
The
nice.
activator will make sure that every request goes green.
I'm adding watches for errors. Um, so what I'd like to do to wrap up, if you feel like we're getting there,
Yeah, I think
is
we
to
we, we Oh no, I was gonna say we
eh,
cover like the API specification, Kubernetes,
uh-huh.
creating a service, hello world, how the
Uh-huh.
sausage is made with pods, scale to zero, splitting traffic, tag based routing, and now duration. So and with all this, that route that you configure is HTTPS. Like every domain name that you create, Knative will create a
Uh-huh.
cert manager or create a let's encrypt endpoint, and it will be HTTPS, that you don't have to worry about like these TLS secrets or configuring the ingress with the right TLS secrets and the domain name. If you configure everything properly, and enable auto TLS, there will be HTTPS by default.
Cool. Oh yeah, we put it up here too.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is kind of recap. We've talked a lot of benefits and we just jumped to one to the other. And it's really great because like I said before I learned more about Knative, I just had it associated with serverless. So it's really cool to see like there's a lot of other values to Knative, even if you have no intention of scaling to zero.
Yeah.
So I would like to recap about what the major benefits are that we've talked about today, or in your mind. I'm going to do this. Or actually, too, if anyone in chat's got a little quiet, but can I do that? I'm trying to add emphasis by doing two markers at once, but I think it's a mess.
I need 3D
So if
glasses
anyone
to
in
see that.
the exactly, I'll just do this. I'm just gonna write it normally. I don't know why I'm trying to be fancy. Okay, so we're
Underline.
gonna yeah. Thank you, Carlos. What would I do without you? I'm going to underline in two different colors.
Yes.
Yeah.
With
Okay.
rainbow colors.
So with rainbow, did you see the little rainbow I drew on our
Yeah,
revision
so
too for our rainbow uniforms? Okay. So some major benefits that we're seeing here. Definitely scale to zero. Well, maybe let's try to do it chronologically when we got the way we went through.
yeah, I
I'm
think
trying to think here.
contain that summarized like containers anywhere, right? You write a container, you can run it anywhere.
But that's more of a benefit of containers than Knative, right?
Um Yeah, I think so. Yes, yes. So maybe it's a serverless containers anywhere.
Does I have another question. Does serverless mean the same thing as scale to zero to you, or does it mean something else?
It means serverless has like 10 definitions.
Yeah, that's
The most popular one is around billing. You don't pay if it doesn't get used,
uh-huh.
and usually that's associated with you shut down things if they don't get used. So that gets associated with
Uh-huh.
scale to zero.
We have okay. So do you feel like I should write serverless as a benefit or scale to zero as a benefit? Or both?
You can put scale to zero. I think that's a
Okay.
benefit for because most
And then
people today when they get into the Knative technology, they have their own Kubernetes cluster and they don't want to have that many nodes, so they want to scale zero when they're not used. So that's more
it
associated with
saves
Kubernetes folks. Yeah,
right on. And then we have it from chat from Gabriel. Hey, nice to see you, Gabriel. Less YAML is a major benefit.
yeah. The simplification of the abstraction of like I have done it. Like I put a label on the service, and the label is not a deployment because somebody else edit the deployment file. So having one YAML that has the ingress, the deployment, and the service, and the autoscaler. Well, in HPA, I don't have to write an HPA YAML, so it's like almost 5 YAML files that I don't have to write. I just need to write 10 lines of YAML.
That's great. And that simplifies deployment. So
Yes.
it's pretty much the same thing. Great. And then we have, I would say, not just auto scaling, I guess scaling with using concurrency metrics instead of
Yes,
with CPU
concurrency.
memory.
Yeah, concurrency is
Okay.
concurrency scaling. Yep. Which there's if you look in the docs, we have other knobs like request per second scaling. The concurrency is the default one. You can also configure the HPA. Usually, it's not used a lot
Mm.
because people are moving out of HPA to use concurrency to use Knative. Um, but yeah, it's concurrency scaling is the major benefit where people can scale can set the concurrency to one and get the same functions as a service, fast experience as something else.
Um, is function as a service synonymous with concurrency to one, or do
Yes.
they just are they just opted? They are. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Cool. And so there was also, we talked a lot about traffic splitting and canary deployments and testing routes. How could we capture that as a benefit? Maybe, well,
I
just
think
traffic
there'll be
splitting.
two like traffic splitting and also
Uh-huh.
canary deployments. We can say
Okay.
'cause we can have traffic splitting and never implemented the tag based routing. So the tag based routing is very good
Okay.
to have access to a certain specific revision to your canary testing. And
Uh-huh.
also for the benefits of people watching this, not just a URL. Now you can use a header. So like a web app, a browser app can use a header to specify the tag for that revision instead of the URL. So you can still hit the main URL,
Cool.
but specify a
Mm-hmm.
header to hit
Nice.
the revision that you want. And that was a feature. These are the features that the community comes up with, ideas,
Uh-huh.
right? Requests, and we just evaluate them. It's like, yeah, that's a good idea to add, and those are the type of things that we just add but with the based on the community feedback.
And then we also talked about how easy it would be to roll back if our rainbow introduced a CVE.
Yeah, yeah, duration
So
based
roll.
yeah, rolling updates, rolling out updates.
So
Oh, you mean the
I
duration?
had that
You
as
said
two different
duration?
things. I guess it's all the duration is a whole separate thing to me than introducing a CVE and being able to easily get
Oh,
back to an old
rollback. Yeah,
revision.
rollback. Yeah,
Yeah.
rollback to make it yeah,
Okay.
easier
So
rollbacks. Yeah,
rollbacks and then the duration based rollout would
yeah.
also
I
be
think
a
that's also another
benefit.
one. Yeah,
And then
I
one
would
thing I
add
don't think we captured.
the
Yeah.
one that we didn't capture that I think I'm the one that I really like. Once you use it, fall in love with SSL auto TLS.
That's that's what I was gonna say. Awesome. We're on the same page. So we'll call that auto TLS
Yeah,
is the
auto
best way to write
TLS
that down here.
or HTTPS, you can say. But auto TLS describes the feature because it's automatic. You don't have to do it manually.
Yeah, it's set up with the as part of the install
Yeah.
and then able to be used easily by developers. This has been amazing. I've had so much fun, Carlos. Thank you for
Yeah.
teaching us
Wow. I
about
didn't know
Knative
it was
Serving.
so much. I thought I was afraid that we didn't have enough to talk to because we were not doing eventing or like serving. We'll see how much content that I mean, I talked for 20 minutes, but maybe I like to talk
I
about. It was
I asked a lot of
the rainbows and the
questions.
unicorns got me hooked.
Does anyone, if anyone in the chat has any questions, it'd be great to post them up now. I wanted to say, Carlos, I really enjoyed on Twitter the memes you made. Carlos was on vacation recently, and he kept throwing up memes that he made of his vacation photos, and they had me rolling.
Yeah,
So I
you can follow me
suggest
on
you
Twitter. I usually do that in
follow
vacation
Carlos on
because
Twitter.
I don't want to feel guilty with my wife and my daughter like in vacation and then doing technical things or my newsletter. I also have a newsletter. So I just try to like cheat a little bit by putting a meme with the technical. So I went to Kubernetes World, which is Disney World, and with all your
Uh-huh.
conditions become true.
The Jumbotron was my favorite one, I
Yeah.
think. So, both of our Twitter handles are in our names right now. So please follow us on Twitter and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you.
Yeah, no
Thanks,
problem.
Carlos.
Thank you for everyone joining. Bye, Whitney.